Now that we've discussed statistical studies, let's discuss types of biases that can come about. Um, this is something very prevalent in our media. It depends on what media channel you watch, right? And they will give you studies or information that just further alongs your opinion sometimes. So, what is bias in general? Well, that is, let's change from red to blue. It's a prejudice for or against something. So sometimes we aren't even aware of our biases. Um, it's something we all have to consciously work on. Now, what is bias in a statistical study? Now, this happens, to go back to earlier notes that we took for 3.1, that convenience method, a lot of bias can be there, right? Because I'm only going to talk to the students that favored me to get information, or the doctor I discussed in the statistical methods who wants to further along his medication. Um, so this can come about often. And what we really need to do is, let's define it first. It's a systematic inaccuracy of the statistical results. We want to avoid this by choosing a sample that is representative of our population. All right. Some sorts of or sources of bias are as follows. So I just took this from our text. There's this sampling bias when the sample is not representative of the population. All right. So case in point, that convenience method would be a sampling bias. One of those is known as the voluntary response bias. So we have to rely on volunteers to give us information. And that's hard to do to actually get your population represented well. There's the self-interest study, so a bias that can occur when the researchers have an interest in the outcome. Some ways to avoid that is companies will hire a third party to run the statistical study. Unfortunately, if they're paying them, that can become problematic as well. There's the response bias, where the responder gives inaccurate responses for any reason. So some of that might be because perceived lack of anonymity, and what that means is, the responder is fearful of how they might be judged, right? Or the fact that they're not anonymous, so they might lie. Or loaded questions, right? So the questions are just influencing the subjects to answer a certain way. And then the non-response bias is when people refusing to participate in the study can influence the validity of the outcome as well. So what I would like you guys to do is to pause the video and go through A through F and try to identify the potential source of bias for all of these situations. Okay, so pause it, try on your own, and then come back. All right, so hopefully you paused. I'm gonna go, what do I want? Purple. So A says a survey asks how many sexual partners a person has had in the last year. That can be hard for some people. It's personal information. People can feel judged with the answer. And so that is why this potential source of bias would be perceived lack of anonymity. Let's get a Y in there. There we go. All right. A radio station asks listeners to phone in their choice in a daily poll. So we're relying on people to take time out of their day and call us. We're not reaching out to anyone. And so that's why this would be voluntary response bias. All right, C. A substitute teacher wants to know how students in the class did on their last test. The teacher asks the 10 students sitting in the front row to state their latest score. That is awful, so hopefully no one has been through that. Because the teacher is focusing on the proximity of students, right? The teacher is just focusing on the 10 students that are closest to them. That is why this would be, let's see, out of our choices, it would be a sampling bias because it's not going to be representative, right? It's only talking to the 10 students that sit in the front row. Okay, D. High school students are asked if they have consumed alcohol in the last 2 weeks. And so hopefully you also realize that this would be perceived lack of anonymity as well, because people can be judged, maybe, especially this is high school, right? So they could get in trouble for their answers. Anonymity. The Beef Council releases a study stating that consuming red meat poses little cardiovascular risk. Okay, look at who's doing the study. Beef Council, and it's claiming red meat is good for us, right? And so because there's like a conflict of interest, this would be self-interest study. All right, the last one. A poll asks, do you support a new transportation tax, or would you prefer to see our public transportation system fall apart? Wow. So this actually brings us back to a fallacy, the logical fallacy. It's only giving us two options, right? Um, and this is also, well, they're really wanting to support this new transportation tax, right? So they're making us fearful if we don't. And so that's why this is known as a loaded question. All right, that concludes our statistical study biases, and we have one more video for 3.1. See you then.